Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Eric Scott. I'm the director of the KU Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm really, really excited to welcome Professor Kate Brown, who's our next speaker in the Legacies of the Cold War, Russia, the United States, and the World Lecture Series, which is sponsored by the US-Russia Foundation. So Kate Brown is the Thomas M. Siebel Distinguished Professor of History of Science at MIT. And her work really stands out to me for many reasons. It is ambitiously and productively transnational and comparative in its approach. It weaves together historical sensibility and a profound knowledge of science and environmental studies. And I think one thing that really stands out is it is also compellingly written, which is all too rare in our profession. And Brown's commitment to creative historical writing can also be seen not only in her books, but also in this really great section of the American Historical Review, which she co-founded, called History Unclassified, which is often the first section of the AHR I turn to when I get each issue. Her first book, she's the author of several books, all of which have won prizes or been stood out for special acclaim. Her first book, A Biography of No Place, From Ethnic Borderland to Soviet Heartland, won the American Historical Association's George Lewis Beer Prize. Her second book, Plutopia, Nuclear Families and Atomic Cities in the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters, won prizes from the American Historical Association, the American Society for Environmental History, the Organization of American Historians, the Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Western History Association. And it's no exaggeration to say that it's one of my favorite historical monographs of all time, and one my students in the Global Cold War class are now reading. Her Dispatches from Dystopia, Histories of Places Not Yet Forgotten, was selected for the Atlantic Monthly's Best Books We Read in 2016. And her Manual Survival book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. So she's someone my colleagues in a variety of fields, not just Russian studies and history, but also Western history and environmental studies, have long talked about bringing to KU. And so we're absolutely delighted to welcome her here today for her talk, The Great American Experiment, Nuclear Testing in the American Heartland. Kate will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. And if you have questions, either during her presentation, we'll start gathering them, and also during the Q&A that will follow. Please feel free to enter them in the chat or in the Q&A function on your screen. So without further ado, I turn things over to Professor Kate Brown.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that really generous introduction and for pitching History Unclassified in the AHR. I'm going to share my screen. I want to talk today about the Chernobyl accident, how we frame the Chernobyl accident, and how, in the course of researching the story over a couple of years, I came to see timelines and the way we do history very differently. And I'll explain what I mean as I go along. But first, let me tell you about this is a book I wrote about it, about the accident, April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded, and then it exploded again. And it released somewhere between 50 and 200 million curies of radioactive fallout. And that's just an awful lot of destructive energy. Within 36 hours, Soviet officials created a zone of alienation. And in the next couple of weeks, they resettled about 120,000 people from a 10-kilometer and then a 30-kilometer circle around the zone. Now, we hear a lot of dramatic stories about this accident, and some of you might have watched the HBO series about it. So when I started researching this in 2014, I was really surprised to find out that we know very little for certain about the consequences of the accident. How radioactive was this territory? What happened to the environment? How many people died and got sick? And all these numbers, all of these questions were controversial, and people had big fights about them. So I thought I'd try to solve that, figure out that question. And so I did what historians first do. I went to the archives in Kiev, and I said, I'd like the medical files on the Chernobyl accident. And the archivists laughed at me. They said, that was a banned topic during the Soviet Union. You're not going to find anything. It didn't take a great sleuth, though. We looked around in about 4 minutes. We found whole document collections labeled in plain Ukrainian, the medical consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. Now, I don't think these archivists were trying to lie to me. I think what happened is no historian had ever pulled these archives before. And if you don't pull the documents, the archivists don't know they exist. I started looking at this big stack of records, and there was so much in there, just a Klondike of records, that I realized that I was going to be at this job for years. And what I found in the documents was a lot of surprises. For instance, Moscow leaders said, we created this zone of alienation, and the radiation is safely contained within the zone. But what I found is that there were deliberate events where they spread radiation outside of the zone. In one case, 3 days after the accident, a big storm front was brewing and heading northeast towards the big Russian cities, including Moscow. So pilots went up and they seeded the clouds to let radioactive rain fall on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. And you can see here from this map, here's the Chernobyl plant is right about here. This is Belarus. This is the whole map of Belarus. You can see right next to the plant these angry red spots of high levels of radiation. The pilots hung back as they flew over the pretty big city of Gomel here, and then they let it loose right here in the Mogilev province of southern Belarus. And you can see these areas here are just as hot as right at ground zero. This is really a second Chernobyl zone. Now, you might call this a triage operation. 200,000 people live down below in those rural areas, but it saved millions of people in Russian cities. The only problem is they didn't tell anybody in Belarus, not even the leader of the Belarusian Communist Party, that they did this. So people lived in that. Here, this area was evacuated down south here. This area, people lived until 1999, 14 years of high levels of exposure. Another story is that Soviets said that we tested the food and we find it's safe. I went through the Ministry of Agriculture records and I found all kinds of records of contaminated food. In one case, 100,000 head of livestock were so exposed that the animals are getting sick and dying. So they slaughtered the animals, and then they didn't know what to do with it. Meat was a really valuable product in the Soviet Union. They hated to just throw it out. So what I find in the archives is a manual for meat packers. And that's why I call this book Manual for Survival, because all of a sudden there's all these new instruction manuals for doctors, lawyers, people, farmers, meat packers, telling them how to manage in a post-nuclear landscape. And I think this is one of the first instances in human history where we have these cases. So the meat packers manual said, take the meat and grade it medium, low, medium, and high levels of radiation. The low and medium levels, mix it with clean meat and make sausage, and send that sausage all across the country and label it as you normally would. Just don't send any to Moscow. Now you know where the meat packers lived who wrote that manual. The high level meat, put it in freezers and wait for it to decay. Well, pretty soon I see that the Gomel meatpacking plant, they're asking for more freezers, and they keep asking, they don't get enough. So they find a refrigerated train car and they shove in 60 tons of high level radioactive meat, and they sent it to Baku. In Baku, the Geiger counters go off, so they send it to Armenia, and on and on. For 4 years, this radioactive ghost train circulated around the western half of the Soviet Union until finally in 1990, the KGB buried it inside the Chernobyl zone where it should have gone in the first place. I could see from the typical radiation map that hotspots of health problems occurred in places that were relatively clean. For instance, here's again the Chernobyl zone. This pretty clean town of Chernihiv, I found that there were 100 female workers in a wool factory that got status as liquidators. Now, liquidators are people with documented exposures who got special compensation for having cleaned up the accident. I'm wondering, we're used to thinking of liquidators as firefighters rushing at these radioactive flames. What were textile workers, women, doing in a relatively clean town to get those levels of radiation? I looked around the archives, I found some information, but finally I just drove up there. And first I talked to the management, and the manager said, yeah, we had a problem in 1986, and we called in a commission from Moscow, and we changed our process, and we got the wool perfectly clean. Problem solved. I wasn't so sure about that. So I asked to go down on the line, and I went down on the line, and out of the 200 women on my list, 10 were still on the job, and they picked their names out of the list. And I said, you know, where's everybody else? And they said, well, they've died or they've been invalided out on pension. What were these women doing to get such a high dose? They were picking up bales of dirty wool that measured 3.2 microrotagen an hour. That's like picking up an X-ray machine while it's turned on and doing it many times a day. These women didn't have a high school degree, but they pointed to parts of their bodies that were diseased or ached, and they knew exactly which different radioactive isotope lodged there. They had a pretty good knowledge of radioactive medicine. They also had an understanding of radioecology. They said, sure, we got this wool clean, but what do you think happened to the wastewater leaving the plant? And I said, I don't know. And they said, it went into the drinking reservoir. Well, I didn't believe that, but I went to the archives and their story checked out. Here's another story. Officially, Moscow officials said that they gave 900,000 medical exams to Soviet citizens potentially exposed to the accident, and they found no change in health statistics. They said, Moscow officials said that they had hospitalized 300 people due to exposures from Chernobyl. I went through the medical records and counted not 300 people hospitalized from exposures from Chernobyl, but 40,000 just in the summer after the accident, 11,000 of whom were children. Children and pregnant women were especially hard hit. Doctors recorded increase in thyroid problems, complications at birth, birth defects, infant mortality. In 1987, in contaminated regions, half of all children had enlarged thyroids. Deaths of children after 10 days doubled in 1987, and they tripled in 1988. You have these counties where of 103 pregnancies, 61 babies are born alive. Among adults, too, a whole host of health problems increased in frequencies. Cancer rates climbed in that second Chernobyl zone in Mogilев province, 5 times higher than the rest of Belarus. And here you have 2 people, both post-op from thyroid cancer. And you can see this boy has some growth hormone problems in addition to thyroid cancer. Here's a couple of visualizations. This document says that we looked at 1,553 kids in this one county. Of them, 1,132 had one chronic health problem or another. 80 to 90% of kids in these areas would be sick with something, often with multiple health problems. Here's a record that shows the rates of chronic anemia among young 4-year-olds from 1986 to 1989. And this is just like an arrow pointing towards infinity. I worked to sort out this confusing record. Officially, the UN archives, UN records say that 33 to 54 people died from Chernobyl exposures. Greenpeace estimated about 90,000 people died. I found in Ukraine that they gave compensation to 135,000 women whose husbands died of a Chernobyl-related illness. And that's just counts men, no women and children in that count, men old enough to get married, and men with documented exposure. So that's just a limited population. Belarus and Western Russia that got far higher, right over here, far higher levels of fallout went to these areas. Those countries have not released any official records on health problems from the Chernobyl accident. So who was right? Was there really a public health disaster involving potentially 4 million people that we don't know anything about? Could an accident of this scale have slipped beneath the radar? As I worked my way through the archives, I found all kinds of contradictions in the record, confusing and conflicting measurements, plus some strange occurrences. Right when UN officials came in 1990 to look at the Chernobyl problems, 4 computers and hard drives went missing from the only 4 computers in the Soviet Union that had records of people, their dose records, how much radiation they had received. And I saw records where the KGB was saying, we can't let these foreigners get a hold of our intellectual data. I found that the KGB planted false information in the newspapers. I also noticed that UN consultants disappeared evidence and dismissed about half of the research sent to them by Soviet, mostly Ukrainian and Belarusian researchers. I was doing this all during the 2016 elections and the WikiLeaks scandal. And I thought to myself, what if there's evidence in this archive that was planted there for me to find later? But it's false. I realized people lie, therefore archives lie. How do I fact check this story? So I figured, maybe trees don't lie. And so I thought I would go look at the ecological archive, the ecological record. And one thing to know about the Chernobyl accident, it occurred right here in the midst of Europe's largest remaining swamp, the Pripyat marshes. And this is an absolutely gorgeous ecosystem. It's a big sandy bowl transected by 17 rivers that break up into hundreds of streams and bogs and lakes. One thing you need for nuclear power is a lot of water. In the 1960s, the Soviets dried up large parts of the swamp for agriculture and to have space for this, what was going to be Europe's largest nuclear power plant. And there's only a small part of it that still worked like a marsh. And I wanted to get a baseline. And so I went to this Omani Swamp. The reason it was not dried up is in the 1960s, Soviet generals made it into an Air Force bombing range. And so I asked a forester to give me a tour, and we went around and we looked at spent ordnance and where the generals, the towers, where the generals looked at the flight paths. There had been a couple of villages in there. We went to these old villages sites before they were resettled. And the only thing left were some cemeteries. And we're sitting around looking at this old cemetery, and I see this bomb crater and some pine trees growing out of the bomb crater. And I take a closer look at the pine trees, and I see these strange looking pine needles. Pine needles are all supposed to go in the same direction. They're all supposed to line up like soldiers, but these are all curling in different directions. And that you see that one that's, got that round figure. That's a mutation. And biologists would call this pine tree disorderly, disorganized. And there's a couple of things that can cause pines to have mutations, but a big cause is radiation. So I asked the forester, how old do you think this tree is? And he said, about 40, 50 years. And I said, well, Chernobyl occurred only 30 years ago. And he's like, yeah, you're right. And we looked around, we didn't see any other trees growing out of bomb craters, and we didn't see any other trees with mutations. But I put this twisted pine needle in a file I had with unverified accounts of nuclear testing in this Air Force bombing range of small strategic nuclear weapons. I didn't have confirmation because those records are closed in Moscow, but I had some other evidence. This was a map that Soviet experts in nuclear emergencies made in the 1960s. They went through this whole swamp and they looked at radioactive cesium in the water, in the soils, in plants, and in villagers' bodies. And they found 10 to 30 times higher levels of radioactive cesium in villagers' bodies than people in Minsk and Kiev. Now, this map was made 10 years before they even broke ground on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And looking at this map, I started to understand that there's a persistence of radioactive contaminants in this part of the world. And it started to make me think that maybe we mischaracterize the Chernobyl event as an accident. Maybe we should instead think of it as an acceleration on a timeline of nuclear events. And I think the reason that's important is because if you see Chernobyl as an accident, as a discrete event, then it has a clear beginning, middle, and end. But seeing Chernobyl as a point of acceleration on a timeline of contamination, I began to visualize a much larger series of events that are ongoing and in flux, that don't end, that shape the present and future as I try to write about them. And that made Chernobyl to be a kind of slippery event to write about in terms of time and scale. Let's take time, for instance. Physicists have been saying for 150 years that, 100 years, sorry, that time is, as we know it in ticked out minutes and years, is a human construct. That really time expands and contracts in unpredictable ways. And the Chernobyl accident sort of proves that to be true. People, for instance, who were exposed to Chernobyl contaminants experienced a rapid radiation aging. You know, the organs of a 25-year-old would present as those of 65 or an 85-year-old. For them, time sped up. Meanwhile, if you went to the red forest, this is the part of the Chernobyl zone that took the hardest hit of radiation. And the pine trees there turned red and they died in 1986. And the foresters came in and they cut down the trees. This photograph was taken 25 years later. Now, these pine trees should have decomposed and turned to dust, but there were no insects and microbes to do that work of decomposition. So here in the red forest, time slowed down. If Rumpelstiltskin woke up 25 years later, he wouldn't have known how much time had passed. So this problem of time, and there were other problems of the great scale of the accident, led me to continue to search for ways other than text and numbers to try to understand Chernobyl as an environmental and a social and political event. So I called up two of the only biologists I could find who regularly go to the zone. This is Tim Musso and Anders Moller. They go every June and every September into the zone to run a series of experiments. And they've been doing that since 1999. And they were kind enough to let me join them on their trips. Now, when you read the press, they often talk about how nature is thriving in the Chernobyl zone. And that's a really seductive story because it means we can screw up whole areas, whole ecologies. Humans step away and nature fixes the story. As you see, this BBC reporter is working hard to get that story, but couldn't find any wild nature to photograph in the zone. I've seen very little of it myself when I visited, but they have some caged animals where we stay in the town of Chernobyl, and so you can snap a picture there. The real story is more complicated. Radiation differs by 4 orders of magnitude in the Chernobyl zone. Some areas like the Red Forest are really hot, other areas are relatively clean. In the hotter areas, the biologists have found that you know, for instance, they counted that there were fewer pollinators. If with fewer pollinators, you have fewer frugivores, fruit-eating birds, for instance. With fewer frugivores, there's fewer seeds that spread. So they count all of 3 fruit trees that seeded after 1986. What they're seeing is a whole cascade of extinction. Every rock we turn over, Musso said, we find damage. Now, in 2017, I was with them and they said, we woke up one morning, they said, we're going to go to the Red Forest. Now, I had been hoping to avoid that experience because radiation levels there are still pretty high, about 50 to 100 microsieverts an hour. But I decided, you know, I would go wherever they went. So off we went. And when you get there, it's a pretty ugly forest. You know, this is a pine tree that was planted commercially for lumber. It's supposed to grow board straight. And you can see this pine tree it has so many mutations, it's not getting that message. These are pine trees here, but they only are managing to become shrubs. And you see the ground cover, it should be a lush Ukrainian forest. It's looking pretty scabby. But the thing that was really upsetting me was my Geiger counter. It was shrieking. Instead of 50 to 100 microsieverts, it's at 994. And I asked the biologist, what's going on here? They said, oh, there was a fire about 8 months ago, and it volatilized all the radiation stored in the leaf litter, and that all turned into smoke and ash. And you're standing on it right now. Now, when we got out of the zone, I checked the press. There was no media about this. It was a pretty big nuclear event. The International Atomic Energy Agency probably would have scored it like a level, 4, but they didn't scale it at all. And I think that's the problem we have with long radioactive half-lives. It's the same we have with chemical toxins, is that the time scales stretch beyond the capacity of social memory and human attention. So if that crooked tree in the swamp showed how radioactivity predated Chernobyl, the Red Forest shows how radiation events continued long after it. And this ongoing quality really plagued Soviet leaders. In the 1990s, they announced that the biological load was too much for villagers living still in populated areas outside of the Chernobyl zone. And they said, well, they're going to move 200,000 more people. But before that could happen, the Soviet Union fell apart and there was no money or political will to move anyone. And as that happened, UN agencies took over managing the assessments of the disaster. And they asserted, especially scientists from the International Atomic Energy Association, that resettlement wasn't necessary. The doses, they said, compared with Hiroshima survivors, were too low. And so pressured by UN officials, delegates at the UN General Assembly voted down Chernobyl aid in the form of $1 billion in today's funds to do two things. One was to move those 200,000 people, and the other was to carry out a long-term health study on chronic low doses of radiation, the kind of radiation that Chernobyl delivered, as opposed to the one big X-ray that Hiroshima delivered. That health study never occurred. We still don't know much about chronic low doses of radiation. As the post-Soviet economic crisis deepened, subsidies for clean food and medical monitoring withered. The new neoliberal orientation of Ukraine and Belarus in the late 90s made it easier ideologically to abandon people to their own fate on contaminated ground. And I think we see this globally. As more and more people live in environments saturated with toxins, risk has become privatized. Now, the constriction of the social welfare state and the planet in a state of ecological stress is a correlation. Whether there's a causation between those two things, I think we in the humanities should not leave just for scientists and politicians to figure out. I think we should weigh in with answers on that. So as these people kept living in the Chernobyl zone, most of the doctors and medical staff fled. There was really no one around to monitor their what was going on with them and what their health effects were. In one of the few Chernobyl studies of birth defects, they found 6 times higher rates of birth defects in that same Omani Swamp area that I showed you earlier. Now that jump in birth defects could be from Chernobyl contaminants. It could be from Chernobyl contaminants and pre-Chernobyl radioactive fallout from nuclear testing. It could be from radioactivity and chemicals from and nitrates from industrial agriculture. My tour through the Pripyat marshes showed me that these areas that these scientists are studying, their living laboratories, are charred remnants pitted with the deposits of spent ammunition, heavy metals, chemical toxin, radioactive waste deposited at a frenetic pace in the 20th century. Now, you might respond to this information by feeling empathy for those people out there in Ukraine. And that's how I was taught to think of history as something that plays out in national boundaries. But now that we have an awareness of the planetary scope of human actions, we know that those events out there make it home to us here. And let me tell you what I mean by that by giving you an example. As I traveled in the Chernobyl territories in the summers, I saw just thousands of people going into the swamps and picking blueberries. And this was on an industrial scale. Mostly women and children picked berries, and they'd come out and they would sell their berries to buyers who were parked on the roads right beside the forest. And I asked the buyers, they bought like 2 tons a day. So my research assistant and I, we went undercover berry picking, and here I am, I've just finished selling my berries. And then we followed the buyers to the warehouse where a wholesaler was buying these berries again for export into the European Union markets. And there was this nice lady, and she was buying the berries, and she bought our berries. But before she bought the berries, she measured them all for radioactivity. And I asked her, how many of these berries are radioactive? She said, all the berries are radioactive. She said, but some are really radioactive, like 3,000 becquerels a kilogram. At the time, the Ukrainian limit was 450 becquerels a kilogram. So we stood around and we watched, and she put the dirtier berries on one side and the cleaner berries on the other side, but she bought all the berries. And I asked the pickers, why is she doing that? And they said, well, it's like the sausage. You mix the cleaner berries with the dirtier berries, and then you get to the European Union threshold, which is 1,250 becquerels a kilogram, and then they can go into European markets, meaning berries that have 3,000 becquerels a kilogram are arriving on European breakfast plates. Now, you still may say, okay, thank God, that's still a good distance from my breakfast plate. But I noticed in the Homeland Security records that there was this truck crossing the border between the US and between Canada into the US, and inside was a big radiating mass. And so I called up that agent and I said, what was in that truck? And he said, oh, those were berries from Ukraine. I said, what did you do with them? He goes, well, they were within the permissible limit, 1,250 becquerels a kilogram. So we let them in. So now those berries are coming closer home to us. If you asked a specialist in radiation medicine about that, he would say, it's usually he, don't worry about it. All of us have radioactive toxins in our bodies. And I think that point underlies what I have found, that Chernobyl accident serves only as an exclamation point in a chain of toxic exposures that remastered landscapes, societies, politics, and bodies, including our own bodies. Describing Chernobyl as an accident is a broom that sweeps away this larger story that I think is more important. So one reason there's so little research on Chernobyl medical effects is because of the toxic complexity of these landscapes, and scientists just throw up their hands and walk away. But the other reason I found working my way through 5 UN archives is that UN agents worked to cover up and minimize the story of a public health disaster. I found them hiding biopsies of kids with cancers, burying data, slandering and discrediting opposing scientists, trying to get them fired. Now, you might ask, why would UN agencies do that? But I found that UN officials serve their client states, and their big client states, the US, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia, are also the big nuclear powers. And in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, archives were becoming declassified. And as that happened, people were finding out that in the Cold War record of the production and testing of nuclear weapons had exposed all kinds of places around the world to radioactive fallout in high levels. Let's look at a comparison. The Nevada test site released 150 billion curies of radioactive iodine-131. That's a pernicious radioactive isotope that goes to the human thyroid, and it causes thyroid cancers, thyroid disease, and a host of other health problems. Chernobyl, 1 order of magnitude lower in comparison. Here's a dose reconstruction of that from the Nevada test site of radioactive iodine. Here we have the Nevada, this is right here's around Nevada, right? Ground zero, the brown areas are the hottest areas. We see that radioactive fallout went up with the trade winds, went north, and it started heading west and came down with precipitation. And I think you see here in the Midwestern grain belts, Minnesota and Iowa, as contaminated, as hot as that ground zero in Nevada. Also over here, I think one reason we have these brown spots is there are a lot of monitors, and this is where Kodak was in upstate New York, and they were monitoring because the radiation screwed up their film, destroyed their film. So they had a lot of monitors out. And here's Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and you guys are right around in here, huh? Now, as these lawsuits boiled up in the 1990s, billions of dollars of liabilities from people who were living in these testing areas, the nuclear scientists devised a narrative. And the narrative was, if you could say that Chernobyl was the world's worst nuclear disaster, and you've already seen it's not, but if you could say that, and then you say only 33 people died, then those lawsuits and liabilities and the cost of cleanup could go away. And that's indeed what happened. None of those lawsuits proved true in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Here again, scale confounds the issue. Global fallout spread after 1951, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. In the same decades, the rates of cancers started to rise precipitously, especially cancers among children. It used to be a medical rarity. Now you see advertisements for childhood chemotherapy drugs on the bus. Male sperm counts dropped in half from 1945 to now, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. People born after 1952 have climbing rates of cancers. Now, these diminished human health indicators became a new background against which Chernobyl statistics were measured. And scientists call this a shifting background syndrome. In other words, the scale of possible damage from global testing that released at least 150 billion curies of just one isotope is too oversized for us to even see. It's a huge fact saturating our daily existence. So I want you to just leave you with this photograph of this girl with blue lips. She picks some berries and eats some berries and puts some in her bucket. I hope you see now how she's also a nuclear waste worker there to make a living on the toxic detritus left behind by others. But I think there's also another way to look at this story. Those berries, and later the mushrooms they pick, are doing what an army of Soviet and international scientists had not managed to accomplish. They're cleaning up radioactivity from the environment. Now, if you pay these swamp dwellers $25 a day, which they need to make to live, and deposit the berries in radioactive waste dump, then I can envision a solution on multiple levels. And maybe the disaster tourists who flock to the zone could, go and pick berries, radioactive berries, take a selfie eating a radioactive berry, and then also deposit it as radioactive waste rather than send it globally as a food product. I think it just takes looking at our environmental problems without denials, with our eyes wide open, and then I think we can picture a brave new world. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kate, for that really powerful talk, and really, as always, really compellingly working in your research process and your methodology into this story. We now have time until 5 p.m. for questions. So if you do have questions, please enter them in the chat. I know my colleague, Sheda Jahanbani, who teaches the Global Cold War class with me right now, we were just talking about student questions for Professor Brown. So students, community members, anyone who's out there, please feel free to send in your questions. And while we're waiting for that, I just thought I'd ask. I've seen on your website also. I've heard you're thinking for your next project. We're working on something called plant people, if I'm getting that right. And I saw how you're weaving in analysis of berries and plants here. So I'm kind of wondering if you could just say a little bit about the genesis of that project and maybe how it connects to this one.
Yeah, I guess I started, thinking about these blueberries and what happens when we use plants, when humans use plants as their allies. And of course, we do that every day. Every time we bite into a veggie burger, we're drawing on plant life to sustain ourselves. And so I got sort of fixated on people who are connected with plants. Now that we know that plants are sentient. Some people even say they have consciousness, but we definitely know that they speak and hear and listen and communicate with each other, but also across species. We're starting to have a new concept of plants as charismatic beings. And so that's what got me going. But then I started to realize that there's a history of people living in cities, and people living in cities have long grown their own food. And this is something that those of us writing about urban history, have sort of overlooked. There's sort of little tiny gardens everywhere that until in the United States, until about 1950, was a big part of food production, especially for the non-staple crops. So I'm looking at how sort of cutting people off, how working class, especially urban self-provisioning, created all these new technologies to use cities as places that produce all these resources and minerals that normally are produced as waste, and they go and they foul, water streams and foul environments. But all these urban working class gardeners use those nutrients to produce food out of nothing, out of waste streams, and made these incredible, super productive gardens in cities. And then I'm looking in the States how that was, people were channeled out of doing that. And that's it, sort of state laws and municipal leaders weaponized food security in a way that made people more and more dependent and forced people from being self-sufficient producers to consumers who are highly dependent, often in much worse shape.
Great, thank you. And we'll look forward to reading more about that as you work on it. There's 2 questions that have just come in. The first is from my colleague in the history department, Andy Denning, who writes, great talk. How has the treatment of this event changed, if at all, in the shift from Ukraine as part of the Soviet state to Ukraine as an independent state, one with significant tensions with Russia? Is independent Ukraine still burying or avoiding discussion, or has it referenced the meltdown as a tool of domestic or international politics?
Yeah, I mean, right from the start, Andy, they used Chernobyl as a way to make an argument for independence. They said, look, this is what Moscow did to us. Moscow had the bright idea of putting this nuclear power plant right here and in this vulnerable swamp right next to water sources. And then it was Moscow that engaged this huge cover up. So, if you go to the Chernobyl Museum, one of the founding museums for independent Ukraine, which is based in Kiev, it's filled with Ukrainian religious and village, folk symbolism. Even though Chernobyl, ironically, was a Polish Jewish shtetl, very few Ukrainians lived in this town of Chernobyl, and the Pripyat, the nuclear town that was depopulated, was mostly had migrants that came from Russia and other parts of the Soviet Union, but they've appropriated Chernobyl as a symbol of their martyrdom, and the reason why they needed to rule from Kiev rather than from some other capital. Now, I would argue that Ukraine and even Ukrainian Soviet leaders were the most forthcoming and looked at this problem, I think, most honestly, and you can see it in the documents. They're really making the arguments to evacuate women and children, especially, have more food protection measures, have more monitoring, all that kind of stuff. Once it got expensive in the mid 1990s, they started sort of rolling that back a little bit, but they're still the only state that publishes records that's sort of left to deal with the disaster. And the Russian and Belarusian cases are deplorable in comparison.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from a student in our Global Cold War class, Angela Davis, who asks, given your statement of how people and records can lie, and in particular, I really personally, this is my own editorial comment, but I thought it was really good. You brought up to raise the notion that archives can also lie, because historians tend to think, well, the archive will, maybe not have the full truth, but that will be more accurate. What steps do you take to feel confident that your research is the truth or is accurate?
I don't believe my research is the truth. I think it's a subjective, take on this event that's my subjective analysis. It's more than an opinion because it's a very well researched analysis. But I'm not certain that I have the full truth here, and I'm sure I've made mistakes. But I thought that using landscapes as an archive was a way to cross-check the human textual story and the stories that people were telling when I was talking to them. So I found it really interesting. I would go to a village and I would be talking to some villager, and this woman would say, she'd say, well, I have this health problem, and my kid has this, and my neighbor over there has that, and it's all from Chernobyl. And what do I know? I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm not carrying out any medical exam. I don't know if what she's telling me is the truth or not. Like, how do I report that? But then after I worked with the biologist, I started to learn how to read the landscape almost like a text. And so I'd look over, I remember looking over, but this woman was talking. I was kind of like, what do I do? And I looked over at this forest, beyond over her head, and I saw the sort of like the fingerprint of a radioactive storm cloud that had gone through that area and caused all these crazy mutations on the edge of the forest, right next to her village. And then I started to think, maybe I should check the records and see how much of a dose this village got. And that, helped me cross-check my story, as I was getting to whether they're anecdotal accounts or whether they were, accounts in archives, that I was wondering about the numbers, I could go and look, as I learned to read the archive, as I learned to read the ecology as an archive, I could try to get closer to the truth by triangulating.
Thank you. Jacob Springer, who's another one of our students here, asks about what further areas do you think require or deserve further research on this topic, and perhaps building on that, whether you think you would recommend scholars looking at this now or researchers to sort of focus on Chernobyl in particular, or perhaps the broader picture, if this is really just an exclamation point or an acceleration of a broader story.
Oh, there's so much there. I mean, it was just me, and I had a researcher assistant in Ukraine and another one in Belarus, and there was only so much the three of us could do. But there were so many records, and we didn't get to every archive. We worked our way through 27 archives, but still, we didn't even get over to Western Russia because the war broke out in 2014, and I couldn't cross that border. You could see over the border, but I couldn't cross it as an American, and people in Russia were starting to think that Americans were a fifth column anyway. So it was in a very friendly research environment. So I skipped that. So there's just so much to do. The ecology of that swamp would be a really fascinating topic. I didn't get into any of the material on the aquatic life. There's, of the rivers, of the fish and the amphibians and things like that. It just goes on and on. Lots more to do. I hope this book just inspires more research.
The next question comes from Olga Klimova, who asks about the weaponization of berries. She writes she encountered people mentioning in texts on Chernobyl that they would sell and buy radioactive berries and apples for the people whom they didn't like, bosses, mother-in-law, etc. It means that were buyers and sellers transparent about where this was coming from, and have you encountered these kinds of attitudes where people deliberately used radioactive products to poison and harm other people?
No, I've never heard that. I guess people don't admit to that kind of stuff right to your face. That's now that you suggested, I could see it happening, and it's horrible. It's hard to avoid though when you're living there. I mean, when you're from that part of the world, a really important source, in the Soviet period, the stores were not serving up citrus. And so if you wanted to get vitamins, and you certainly need vitamin C to get you through the winter without having health repercussions, berries and preserved berries, berries and teas, berries and jams were really important source. And so everybody's taught, you eat as many blueberries as you can, and they're really healthy. So I was, in southern Belarus with my Belarusian research assistant, Katya Krivichanina, and we had just gone into the school where they were testing, they're teaching the kids how to test berries so that when they and the parents go off berry picking, they could figure out just how radioactive the berries were. And so they're showing us how they did that. And we had these berries, and they measured only 350 becquerels a kilogram. Now at that point in Belarus, the permissible limit, because there's so much radiation in Belarus, was 150 becquerels a kilogram. So this is still 200 becquerels over the permissible limit, but they thought it was pretty low. They're like, this is low, these are pretty clean berries. And so my research assistant said, wow, where'd you find those berries? I want to go pick some. And the guy just handed her the bag. And so we got in the car and she starts eating them. And I'd say, what are you doing eating those dirty berries? We just saw that they're way over their permissible, threshold. And she was eating them saying, but they're so healthy, and so it's very hard to change your whole cultural construct of your environment when your environment has been so irreparably damaged and invisibly damaged. And I think this dissonance is extremely difficult to live with. And so I have a feeling people told more stories about, a fantasy of poisoning their boss or something than actually doing that. But I can believe it, it might happen. You'd have to do it a lot. You'd have to have really give them a ton of berries that were really highly radioactive to really have it be effective.
Thanks. The next question comes from my colleague, Sheda Jahanbani in the history department, who writes that she is consistently gobsmacked by the creativity and intellectual brio of your research, and was wondering, I think it would be useful for our students, and also I think for us fellow historians, to hear how about you identify productive and significant historical questions and then develop plans for answering them. Your process as is presented and described in the talk sounds almost improvisational, but of course it can't be because of the nature of our kind of work.
Well, so the derivation of this book, it's almost a sequel to the book I wrote earlier, Plutopia. And I was, going around these radiated landscapes where the Soviets and the Americans made plutonium during the Cold War. And I was talking to all these farmers, and they were farmers in Siberia, and they're farmers in Western Washington. And they were telling me really similar stories about the health problems of their families and of their own bodies. And I'd go to the scientists in both places and they'd say, well, those people are just dumb farmers and they're, they're radiophobic, they're hypochondriacs, that kind of thing. But I was really struck by how similar their stories were. And I knew they didn't share a common language. I knew they weren't much talking to each other. And so I thought, I researched that for Plutopia, but I felt like I didn't really get that story, in part because these are military sites and a lot of the records are under wraps still. And also the military, especially in the American landscape, wasn't terribly interested in what was happening to people who were getting exposed outside of the nuclear reservation. So I thought I would go look at the Chernobyl records and try to write specifically, that's what my research agenda was like, what were the medical effects in a civilian site where, lots of millions of people were exposed. And it was in a time later when we have more records. And I was hoping to find records. And as I said, I found a Klondike of records. So that's what got me going. And then, once I started researching and trying to sift through, I would get confused by all these different kinds of radiation measurements, and sometimes they're in food, they're in becquerels. There's all these different ways of measuring things, internal doses versus external doses, all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, right from the beginning, I thought I needed to get an education from these biologists who I happened to have known already. And so I started my work following those biologists right from 2014, and I continued doing that till I finished researching the book. So it was about a 3 or 4 year period. And then there was some improvisation, like we see all these people picking blueberries and we decide to go undercover blueberry picking and see what that process is like ourselves and follow it through the chain. And that was just something we sort of decided to do spontaneously. Another kind of, the way I got, as I was going through the archives, I saw a lot of people, thousands and thousands of Soviet citizens were writing letters to their government officials saying, did you know what's happening in my community? You must not know this, but we have the schoolyard here where it's just, the radiation is just going crazy. Can you please pave our schoolyard so that these kids can play, they're not playing in radioactive dirt, things like that. And so lots of group petitions. And so I would go and find, we get those addresses, the names of those people, and we'd go try to find them and show them what they had written 30 years before. A lot of people didn't even remember signing, especially a group petition. And we'd ask them what they thought. So that was another sort of way to find people who experienced this and see how, what the difference is between their opinion in 1989 and 2016. And then as we travel along, here another opportunistic research opportunity, again, pretty improvisational, is that I noticed that the bus stops, the buses weren't really working in southern Belarus. And so women and children would hitchhike from bus stops in towns. And so we picked them up in this rental car. And everybody we picked up, I didn't write about this in the book because it's somewhat anecdotal, but of probably like 30 people we gave rides to, everybody was traveling either to or from a medical treatment throughout these. And they would tell us these stories about their health problems, which I didn't report because, as I said, they were anecdotal, but I guess they gave me confidence that what I was finding in the archive that was reporting, especially coming from southern Belarus, what they called a public health disaster, was in fact quite true.
Thank you for that. I wanted to go back to one of the things you said during your talk that really stuck with me, which was this notion that this disaster or series of disasters or broader history of disaster, if it is indeed a disaster at all, but this sort of sense of time and how it was not lining up with the way we like to think of time, or perhaps and I was thinking about why some parts of the story might not be as well known, and why we kind of latch on to the story as it's told, or the story as it's portrayed in the HBO miniseries with a beginning, middle, and an end. And I'm wondering, I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how, as a historian, you write about something that doesn't have, doesn't line up in a temporal sense the way we think about it, and also whether you think this perhaps is one of the reasons why. I mean, yes, there's government secrecy and there's commercial reasons, but I wonder if the way in which it's both an acceleration and also a slow motion type of event maybe makes it hard for people to see or to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, that's a really great observation. I started to realize as I wrote this, here I am an historian, and our bread and butter is timelines and chronologies, cause and effect. I started to realize how chronology is a really conservative, can be, and almost always is a really conservative move, in that implies progress and implies like, yeah, this was a real mess up. And then, look at the typical, like, look at the HBO narrative, here's boom, big bag, horrible thing happened. All these terrible people, forced this plant into an accident, and then all these other people had to go in and clean it up after them, and they were exposed and they suffered terribly. But how does that HBO show end? It ends with justice being done. It ends with the trial, and this guy explaining how it was the design itself of this reactor. And so the big guys were, sitting in Moscow, but nuclear reactor designers were at fault too. And then, the filmmaker feels like they've exposed, the filmmakers have been around talking like, I've exposed Soviet lies, and, lies are at the heart of all these political problems we're having today. Case closed, where, in this book, I sort of minimize the accident itself and go on to the real drama, which plays out as these people have to struggle with these, in these landscapes of radioactive contamination, and figure out how to live with that, figure out how to see it and measure it, and to work around it. And there's just amazing heroes, just sort of what I call everyday heroes, who pop up, who take responsibility for trying to, ameliorate the situation as best they can. And so trying to write, I really struggled with, so how do you write a story that's not chronological, that's out of order? And I experimented in this book. I have one segment where I meet a 97-year-old woman, and I go back every year and I interview her. So she's 97, 98, 99, and 100. And then she finally dies at age 100. But every time I talk to her, she tells me the exact same story again about her. She tells me the same life story. And what I find fascinating about her is that she grew up in this part of Ukraine where there was, World War I, a civil war, Polish-Soviet war, famine, deportations, World War II, Holocaust, genocide, deportation of national minorities, and then Chernobyl. And so everything in the 20th century, all the disasters in the 20th century were thrown at this one area. And this woman lived through it all and was still there. And there's almost nobody around who could tell that story. And so I tell that sort of narrative structure is I have her, as she's telling me her story for the third time, I float up, I levitate, and I've stopped paying attention to her, and I levitate up over, and I start to see her going about her daily peregrinations from her house to the forest to get, herbs, and then to the market to sell her herbs, and then to the wood pile to get the wood, and back and forth she goes. And all around her, the landscape is changing. And the soldiers, the tanks come in, they kill people, the tanks go away. The tanks are retrofitted as bulldozers. They come in, they dig irrigation tunnels, they plow the land for a nuclear reactor. Meanwhile, she's just going back and forth in her small movements, where the landscape around her changes. And so I tried to use that as a way to talk about sort of time shifting in all kinds of directions all at once in a person's lifespan, but also in an ecological lifespan. You can tell me if you think it's effective.
I think the book's very effective, and I recommend it, for anyone out there who hasn't read it, to pick it up, or pick up any of the books I mentioned at the beginning. I want to thank Professor Kate Brown for a really compelling talk here today. I know all of our students and faculty are really grateful to have you here, and so thank you so much for presenting as part of our series. And we'll eagerly await your next book project.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for joining me, and have a good weekend.
All right, thank you too.
Bye-bye.